There's a type of person who gets a table for one and feels absolutely nothing but relief. No embarrassment, no loneliness, just them, their food, and a level of peace that most people only find on vacation. And for years, psychology had them completely wrong. Because here's what we assumed. If you're eating alone, something must have gone wrong. You must not have friends. You must have been rejected. You must be sad about it. We turned a completely neutral act into a social diagnosis, and the research is now showing that assumption was embarrassingly off base. If that just resonated with you, hit that like button, subscribe, and share this with someone who eats alone and has never once needed you to feel sorry for them. Now let's get into it. Let's start with what's actually happening when you sit down at a restaurant, pull out a book, and genuinely enjoy your meal without another human being at the table. First, we need to talk about something called solitary dining, not as a sad last resort, but as a deliberate practice. Researchers at Kokoro Research Center in Kyoto found that people who regularly dine alone report higher levels of mindful awareness during meals. They're tasting their food more. They're present in a way that communal dining often interrupts. Because here's the thing nobody talks about. Eating with other people is cognitively expensive. You're managing conversation, reading social cues, deciding whether to laugh at that joke, monitoring how much you're talking versus listening, all while trying to actually eat a meal. For certain brains, that's not enjoyable. That's multitasking with a fork. And the research backs this up. A 2017 study published in the Journal of Consumer Psychology found that people who eat alone often report greater satisfaction with their food itself because their attention isn't split. They're fully in the experience. The meal becomes the main event, not background noise to a social performance. Now here's where it gets psychologically interesting. There's a concept called autonomous eating, the deliberate, self-directed choice to dine without company, and it's fundamentally different from involuntary solitary dining. One comes from agency, the other comes from circumstance. And the emotional experience of each is completely opposite. When someone chooses to eat alone, they're exercising what psychologists call behavioral autonomy, the experience of acting in alignment with your own values and preferences rather than social expectations. And autonomy, according to self-determination theory developed by Deci and Ryan, is one of the three core psychological needs humans have. When you meet it, you feel good. When it's chronically denied, you don't. So the person who books a solo table at their favorite restaurant on a Friday night isn't lacking. They're, in a very real psychological sense, thriving. They've identified what restores them, and they're doing it, unapologetically, with a glass of wine and no one asking them to split a dessert they didn't want. But we've attached so much stigma to this that most people who enjoy eating alone have spent years either hiding it, apologizing for it, or performing busyness while doing it. You know what I mean. The phone that's a little too visible. The book held at a very specific angle so you look intentional and not abandoned. The practiced expression that says, "I'm waiting for someone even though absolutely no one is coming." That performance is exhausting, and it reveals something important about how we've collectively decided that solitude in public spaces is suspicious. Think about the language we use. Eating alone. The word alone doing all the heavy lifting there, carrying all this weight of inadequacy. But nobody says drinking coffee alone like it's a problem. Nobody looks at someone on a solo walk and assumes tragedy. We reserve the judgment specifically for the dinner table because dining is one of the most culturally loaded acts of connection we have. To sit at a table is, in most cultures, to declare your place in a community. So sitting there without one, we read it as exile. Except increasingly, people are opting out of that reading entirely. In Japan, solo dining has been normalized to the point where it's been infrastructurally accommodated. Restaurants have counter seating specifically designed for one. Ramen shops built their entire layout around the single diner. There's even a term, ohitori-sama, which roughly translates to party of one, and it carries zero social stigma. You walk in, you say ohitori-sama, they seat you like the perfectly valid customer you are. In South Korea, entire television shows are dedicated to celebrity solo dining, myeokbang-adjacent content where the point is watching someone eat alone and genuinely enjoy it. The popularity of these shows tells you something. People aren't just watching, they're recognizing something, seeing their own experience reflected back and feeling, maybe for the first time, like it's okay. Meanwhile, in the West, we're still designing restaurants where solo diners get wedged next to the bathroom or handed a table clearly meant for four, with chairs stacked symbolically around them like furniture-based judgment. Let's talk about what's actually happening neurologically for people who prefer to eat alone. We've established in previous videos that introverts and people who enjoy solitude have more sensitive dopamine systems. They reach their stimulation threshold faster than extroverts. Social dining, with its noise, its unpredictability, its constant input, can push a sensitive nervous system past that threshold quickly. What starts as enjoyment becomes endurance. They're at the table, but they've mentally left 15 minutes ago. Solo dining, on the other hand, gives these individuals complete control over their sensory environment. They sit where they want, they control the pace of the meal, they decide when it's over. That regulatory control isn't antisocial, it's nervous system management. And it's smart. There's also research on something called social facilitation theory, the idea that the presence of others affects performance and experience. For some tasks, people perform better with an audience. For others, the audience is a disruption. Eating, for people who are highly internally focused, often falls in the second category. The meal itself is where their attention wants to go. Having to redirect it socially doesn't enhance the experience, it dilutes it. Now, let's have the honest conversation, because I always want to make sure we're not using psychology to avoid psychology. There's a difference between choosing solitude and needing it to avoid discomfort. Some people eat alone not because they prefer it, but because the vulnerability of asking someone to join them feels too risky. Because past rejection has made communal spaces feel unsafe. Because somewhere along the way, they decided that needing company was a weakness, and they've built an entire identity around not needing it. That's not the same thing, and the distinction matters. Psychologists would describe the healthy version as approach-motivated solitude. You're moving towards something, peace, pleasure, restoration, clarity. The less healthy version is avoidance-motivated isolation. You're moving away from something, rejection, judgment, the terrifying intimacy of being truly seen by another person. The question to ask yourself honestly isn't, do I like eating alone? It's, what happens when I imagine not being alone? Is there relief? That's preference. Is there panic? That might be something else worth sitting with. Not broken, not wrong, just worth exploring with the same intellectual honesty you'd apply to anything else you believe about yourself. For the people who genuinely, autonomously, comfortably choose to eat alone, here's what you figured out that a lot of people haven't. You know that presence isn't proximity. You can be deeply connected to people in your life and still want your lunch hour to yourself. You've separated the act of eating from the obligation of performing sociability. You've reclaimed a basic human function, nourishment, and made it yours again. And there's something quietly radical about that. In a culture that has monetized togetherness, that sells us the idea that every experience is better shared, that frames the solo diner as someone to be pitied, the person who sits down alone and feels nothing but contentment is doing something genuinely countercultural. They're saying, my own company is enough for this moment. Not forever, not as a rejection of others, just for this meal, right now, I am enough to be with. There's a broader psychological principle underneath all of this. The capacity to enjoy your own company, to not need external validation to feel okay about where you are and what you're doing, is one of the most robust markers of psychological well-being researchers have identified. It's not isolation, it's self-sufficiency. And the person who can sit at a restaurant table alone, order what they want, eat at their own pace, and leave feeling genuinely restored, that person has something a lot of people spend years in therapy trying to find. So the next time someone looks at your table for one with that particular expression, the mixture of pity and confusion, you don't owe them an explanation. You don't need to perform loneliness for their comfort or perform contentment for their curiosity. You're just having lunch, and you're exactly the company you wanted today. If this video just describes something you felt but never had the language for, the next one is going to hit just as hard. It's about the psychology of people who genuinely hate small talk. Not because they're rude, not because they're awkward, but because their brains are literally wired for depth over surface, and science finally has an explanation for why certain conversations feel like slow torture while others feel like oxygen. That one's up next. I'll see you there.